I want you to think back to the most important moments in the history of mixed martial arts. The moments that defined the sport. The death of Pride, the UFC Fox deal, Conor McGregor hoisting 2 championships into the air in Madison Square Garden. All of these moments were major, and we knew they were major when they happened. But it's often the little things in life and in mixed martial arts that end up having massive implications later. Moments that were overlooked at the time, that were seen as not that big a deal, that would go on to change and shape the sport in ways nobody could have possibly predicted. And today we're going to take a look at 10 such nothing moments that would go on to change everything. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point. A massive thank you to our channel Hall of Famers, and these are 10 things fans overlooked that ended up massively important. Number 10, UFC 30's location. Sometimes the location of an event can be as important as the event itself, and there might not be any better example of that than UFC 30. The venue was a seemingly minor detail to most that would have far-reaching consequences nobody could have possibly foreseen. 30 would mark the first Zuffa-led UFC event, and if you recall, they still weren't sanctioned in Nevada. They essentially had no pay-per-view distribution. The business was dead in the water. This was the dark ages. So even finding a venue outside of the South was no easy task. But with the previous regime's efforts in New Jersey, a major combat sports market had opened up. Enter Donald Trump. While the Trump Taj Mahal Resort and Casino died in 2016, in 2001 it was a staple of the Atlantic City Boardwalk, and the pre-apprentice Trumpster, who'd already dipped his toes into boxing and pro wrestling, welcomed the UFC with a deal White said made sense for everybody. The promotion would put on back-to-back shows at the Taj to kick off the Zuffa era, sparking a lifelong friendship with the Donald that would have far larger implications when one of the two parties ended up becoming President of the United States. Number 9. What did Chael say? When the American Gangster's TE ratio ended up being nearly 17 times that of a normal man post Anderson Silva title challenge, and he was subsequently suspended for a year, Sonnen found himself before the California State Athletic Commission fighting for an appeal on the grounds that he had a medical condition. With doctor in tow to corroborate his story, Chael talked about his hypogonadism diagnosis, and how he was on a regimen of something called testosterone replacement therapy, something he claimed Nevada was aware of and had given him a medical exemption for. Now, turns out they hadn't, but that's not the important part of the story, or at least it's not anymore. At the time, Chael just making up a conversation with NSAC head Keith Kaiser saw Westland's finest suspended for perjury essentially. But the real bombshell here ended up being TRT, a little known loophole that Sonnen had brought to light that would end up being the biggest crisis in the sport only a few years later.
If you're gonna associate a guy with TRT, make sure you also associate the fact that it's legal and it's not banned.
Number 8, Flash Entertainment joins UFC. While the business of fighting is always intriguing to most UFC fans, I can tell you for a fact that I myself, the average fan in 2010, couldn't have cared less when I heard that something called Flash Entertainment would be purchasing a 10% stake of parent company Zuffa. Big deal, don't care. When is Brock Lesnar fighting again? A few months later, when the UFC headed to Abu Dhabi for the first time, again, I didn't care. Cool. Why is Anderson Silva just dancing around and not murdering Damian Maia? But Flash Entertainment, as it turned out, was a subsidiary of the government of Abu Dhabi, meaning that Abu Dhabi essentially owned a part of the UFC for nearly 10 years. And as you might have guessed, this relationship would have far-reaching implications. It marked a shift towards world fucking domination by the UFC, with overseas markets being a major priority. Big-time talent from regions previously unrepresented in the promotion would start making a huge impact. During the Panduscarino, Fight Island would become a thing as a result. This seemingly nothing story for the average fan like myself back in 2010 was really a sign of what the next decade would look like in the sport. Number 7, Conor mentions Floyd. Hey, do you guys remember magazines?
Is that another old person thing?
Yes, it is. Another old person thing.
There were like these little paper books about various topics. Well, Conor McGregor did an interview with one in 2015 called Esquire, a men's lifestyle magazine. This was when Conor was an up-and-coming star on his way to fight Jose Aldo. Or at least he thought. It ended up being Chad Mendes, but that's neither here nor there. In the interview, McGregor brought up Floyd Mayweather in the context of boxers not being complete fighters. He would go on to say, quote, "If you put me face-to-face with Floyd Mayweather, pound for pound boxing's best, if I fought Floyd, I would kill him in less than 30 seconds. It would take me less than 30 seconds to wrap around him like a boa constrictor and strangle him." Now, you gotta remember, this is Conor McGregor we're talking about here. The guy talks shit all the time about anything and everything, so a throwaway line about Floyd Mayweather meant nothing. Until, of course, it did mean something, because 2 years later, they would end up in the second biggest boxing match of all time. This interview was the seed. There was nothing between them before this, and it was the catalyst that moved things forward. Floyd was asked about what he thought thought about what Conor said, and then it just escalated from there. So remember kids, always shoot your shot in interviews, and it helps if you are the biggest star in an entire industry. Number 6, Olympic judoka joins Strikeforce. Look, if you were watching the early fights on a Strikeforce Challengers card in 2011, then you are truly an elite fan. Furthermore, if you watched Ronda Rousey's first fight with the promotion at a Strikeforce Challengers event and determined that she would flip the entire sport on its head, then I would like you to tell me the winning lottery numbers next week. Sure, Rousey's rise to main event status was quick, but nobody could have predicted how this Olympic bronze medalist would have impacted the sport at the time, rocketing WMMA forward by like a decade, getting women into the UFC. Her first Strikeforce win was controversial too. Sarah D'Elio cried out in pain during an armbar, and so the fight was stopped by Steve Mazzagatti. But it all happened so fast that the crowd wasn't happy, the commentators were confused, it was a big old mess. So if you saw that and said, oh, in a couple years this woman is definitely going to completely change the face of mixed martial arts and be tweeted about by presidents and Lady Gaga, then again, I will give you my bank account number. You are now in charge of all my finances. Number 5, John Skipper resigns. Unless you follow the business of sports broadcasting very closely, you probably didn't know who John Skipper was when he resigned from ESPN. You may still not know, in fact, so let me give you a brief overview. Skip started with ESPN, the magazine, back in 1997, and by 2012 became the president of the whole damn company. One of the big initiatives of his tenure was, of course, ESPN Plus, a service that, had he still been running it today, would not be featuring the UFC because, according to multiple sources, not just Dana White, John Skipper was not a fan of mixed martial arts and did not want it on the platform. But due to a substance abuse scandal, Skip was on the outs with ESPN, and his position as the head of ESPN Plus would be shifted over to a guy named Kevin Mayer, someone who had very close ties to Ari Emanuel, the owner of the UFC. Pair that with new president Jimmy Pitaro being friends with Dana White, and you had the ESPN deal that we are still in currently today. But unless you were on the inside and you knew all of these executives and their relationships with the UFC, John Skipper's resignation wouldn't have meant much to you as a fight fan. Until, of course, it did. Number 4, Joe joins the commentary team. Joe Rogan, the TV actor? Yeah, so when our beloved Joe joined the commentary team at UFC 37.5 back in 2002 and kept calling Chuck Liddell Chuck Liddell, it wasn't that big a deal. Nobody was like, oh my god, the handyman from News Radio is doing commentary for the UFC. This is certainly going to have massive implications for the future. And even if you could have predicted that his time with the UFC would be important and that he would be considered the greatest commentator in the history of the promotion, there is not a chance in hell that you would have realized the impact this man would have on the entire fucking world via his gigantic podcast. But it all stems from that commentary position. With all due respect to Joe's acting career and his stand-up comedy, I think what truly made him a pop culture figure was his position in the UFC. And Fear Factor, if we're being honest. Fear Factor was a big part too. But still, the UFC was a massive part of the growth of his podcast that would of course go on to ridiculous levels later on. Number 3, station casino owners buy UFC. So we always look at this as a monumental moment, but take yourself back to 2001 here. The UFC brand was pretty much non-existent. You couldn't find their product on TV, you couldn't rent new events at Blockbuster. To the vast majority of the population who would have even maybe considered watching UFC if it was readily available, probably didn't even know it was around anymore. Oh yeah, I remember those with Hoist Gracie and Ken Shamrock. Why aren't they doing those anymore? They are, you filthy casual. But as we know, the dark ages were hard times. And so learning that the owners of station casinos had bought this dead brand for $2 million meant exactly fuck all, unless you were an insider of insiders and realized that this could mean MMA heading to Vegas. But even then, there's no possible way you could have known what was to come as a result of these brothers buying up the UFC. And they didn't either, because if they knew, they'd have to sink $40 million more into this thing before it would be saved by reality television. I'm sure they'd have told their childhood buddy Dana to hit the bricks. But of course, they would stick it out, and now the UFC is a juggernaut. They turned that $2 million into $4 billion only 15 years later. Speaking of tough, number 2, new UFC reality show. Okay, so you have to remember that at the start of 2005, there were roughly 30 to 50 reality shows airing in the United States, and that's not an exaggeration. It was the peak of the reality television craze. The market was completely oversaturated, so the UFC announcing that they were going to start a reality show on Spike TV wasn't exactly a big deal. It might have been if you were a big fan of fighting and reality television, but we know that the UFC was pretty much on the verge of going out of business prior to the start of The Ultimate Fighter. And so the vast majority of fans probably didn't imagine that this reality show would literally change everything forever and set the UFC on the trajectory towards mainstream popularity. But of course, that's exactly what happened. And while while the very first episode did have decent ratings if you looked at them today, with the TV landscape at the time, what was available, and the sheer amount of reality TV consumption, it wasn't like episode 1 aired and the UFC was saved, but the ratings would steadily increase as the season went on, culminating in the live finale that would be a monumental moment in the sport and change the UFC forever. But when it was announced that the UFC would be starting a reality show in 2005, nobody cared. Absolutely nobody. Number 1, small promotion gets banned. On January 15th, 1997, the paper of record, the New York Times, ran an article that was titled "Outcast Gladiators Find a Home, New York." The piece was not, in fact, about the UFC, but about a man named Donald Zuckerman. The original Zuck in the fight game ran a promotion called Extreme Fighting, and he was planning on holding an event in Manhattan. But Tommy, MMA was illegal in New York until 2016. How is it that he was going to hold an event in Manhattan? Well, that's because the original UFC owners had successfully lobbied in New York to have mixed martial arts sanctioned. The thing is, though, the politicians wanted to ease into this, which is why the UFC intended to hold an event in Niagara Falls, not exactly New York City proper. Once the ruling went through, though, Zuckerman was like, hey, it's legal to do this in New York, I'm holding a show in Manhattan. All hell would break loose, and this single promoter trying to hold a single event in New York would end up being the catalyst for a complete reversal of the new sanctioning and the outright banning of mixed martial arts shortly thereafter. With New York being one of the major capitals of combat sports, it was pretty much MMA's death knell. And so this seemingly nothing headline in the New York Times about a seemingly nothing MMA promotion ended up being one of the most important moments in the history of mixed martial arts. But not as important as the editor of this video, Max Randall. He does a fantastic job. Please follow him on all his socials and go check out his YouTube channel. A massive thank you to our channel Hall of Famers. We got new pricing on that fight, fans. I highly suggest hitting that join button. There's all kinds of fun to be had. And if not, if you could like and subscribe, that would be fantastic as well. What other little moments ended up being huge? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you all for watching this one. I'll catch you on the flip side.